She was 62 years old, standing before a cabin with no heat, no running water, and a roof that bowed in the middle like something that had already surrendered. Everything she owned fit in the trunk of a 15-year-old sedan. Her husband of 4 decades had left her for a woman half her age, and made certain the court left Linda with nothing worth keeping. The cabin was his final insult, a heap of rotting logs in the Colorado mountains that even he had forgotten existed. He laughed when she pulled out of the driveway. He was certain she would vanish quietly. But what Richard never grasped, what none of them grasped, was that Linda and that cabin shared something deeper than neglect. Everyone had written them off. Everyone assumed there was nothing left inside worth saving. Every last one of them was wrong. If you believe no woman carries an expiration date and that justice finds its way home eventually, subscribe to the channel. This is a comeback that will settle something deep in your chest. Linda Harrison had been 62 for exactly 3 weeks when her world cracked open. She'd spent that morning the way she spent most mornings, brewing coffee in the kitchen of the suburban house she attended for 4 decades. Planning the dinner she'd prepare for a husband who no longer noticed what sat on his plate. The house was spotless. It was always spotless. 40 years Linda had given to the craft of building a comfortable home, raising 2 children, Michael and Jessica, who had grown and scattered into lives of their own. Standing beside Richard, a successful commercial real estate developer, being the wife who held every seam together while he built his empire. She had done everything right, or so she believed. The signs had been there. She understood that later. Richard's evening stretching past midnight at the office, the unfamiliar cologne on his collar, his sudden devotion to the gym, business trips that multiplied like lies. But Linda had trusted him. 40 years of marriage lays a foundation of trust, doesn't it? Trust is the slowest thing a person can build, and the fastest thing to shatter. That morning, Richard descended the stairs in a suit she had never seen, expensive, tailored, cut younger than anything he usually wore. "We need to talk," he said. His eyes stayed on the floor. In 4 decades of marriage, Linda had learned to read every shift in her husband's voice. This tone was not about household repairs, not about vacation plans. This was something else entirely, something final. They sat in the living room, the room Linda had decorated and redecorated across the years. The room where they had celebrated Christmases and birthdays, where laughter had once lived, where their family had taken shape. Richard sat across from her, not beside her. That detail would stay with Linda for a long time. After 40 years together, he chose distance. He said it flatly, no tremor, no hesitation. The words hit Linda like something physical, a blow to the ribs, a hand around her throat. She barely managed the single syllable. He cut her off. Linda's voice dropped to something barely above breath. "You're leaving me for someone our daughter's age." "I'm leaving because I deserve to be happy. I worked hard my entire life. I provided for you, gave you everything. Now I want to live for myself." The cruelty of it stole the air from her lungs. He'd provided, as if her 40 years of running that household, raising those children, propping up his career, charming his clients, keeping his world polished and perfect, meant absolutely nothing. 40 years. Erased in a sentence. Richard continued. And that was it. He stood, he walked out. Left for the office, or maybe for Carla. Didn't look back. Linda sat alone in the living room she had turned into a home. Every curtain chosen by her hands, every photograph hung by her fingers, and understood with a clarity that cut like glass that her life as she had known it was finished. The months that followed were a slow drowning. Humiliation piled on top of legal maneuvering. Richard's lawyers came prepared to strip her bare. Every asset, they argued, belonged to Richard. The house, purchased with his income, the cars, his earnings, the retirement accounts, his career. Linda had been a homemaker. They repeated that word like it was a diagnosis, a disqualification. She'd contributed no financial value to the marriage. That was the phrase they used. No financial value. As though enabling his career by managing every other corner of his life counted for nothing. As though sacrificing her own ambitions to raise Michael and Jessica was a hobby. As though being his partner in every way that actually mattered, the meals, the schedules, the emotional labor, the thousands of invisible hours, was somehow worthless, because no paycheck was attached to it. The cold mathematics of divorce court had no column for devotion. Michael and Jessica tried to stay neutral. They loved both parents. They didn't want to choose sides. But neutrality, when one parent is being dismantled and the other is doing the dismantling, neutrality is its own kind of abandonment. Linda understood their position. She did. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. She faced this alone. The final hearing landed on a grey morning in November. The sky looked like concrete. Linda sat in the courtroom beside her court-appointed lawyer. She couldn't afford one of her own. While across the aisle, Richard sat flanked by his legal team. And Carla. Carla was everything Linda was not. Young, blonde, wearing a dress that cost more than Linda's entire monthly budget. She touched Richard's arm with the confidence of ownership, smiled at him adoringly, performed the role of prize. Linda felt herself becoming invisible. Right there, in that courtroom, under fluorescent lights, she felt herself fading, as if 40 years of existence were being quietly deleted. The judge looked bored. He read through the settlement the way a man reads a grocery list. Richard would keep the house, the cars, most of the retirement accounts. Linda would receive a modest monthly alimony. 5 years, enough time to get on her feet, the judge said, as though 62-year-old women discarded after 4 decades of marriage could simply dust themselves off and start fresh. As though the world was waiting for them with open arms and job offers. __quote _12 _____, Richard's lawyer said, almost an afterthought. The way you mention a stain on a contract. A cabin in the mountains that Mr. Harrison inherited from his father. It's been abandoned for years. No utilities, no value. We propose giving the property to Mrs. Harrison. Richard leaned toward his lawyer, whispered something. They both smirked. My client is willing to deed the property to Mrs. Harrison. Consider it a gesture of goodwill. Goodwill. The word hung in the air like smoke. Linda's lawyer glanced at her, a question in his eyes. Linda had nothing left. Nothing to negotiate with, nothing to protect. She said, quote, quietly. The gavel came down, the marriage was over. 40 years, sealed, stamped, discarded. As Linda walked out of the courtroom, she heard Richard's laugh rise behind her like something sharp. Enjoy the cabin, he called out. Try not to let it collapse on you. Carla giggled. Linda kept walking, kept her spine straight, kept her chin lifted. Refused, with every ounce of whatever she had left, to let them see her break. She made it to her car. Then the tears came. She sat in the parking lot of that courthouse, 62 years old, divorced, nearly destitute, holding nothing but the deed to a property her ex-husband had handed her as a punchline. A final joke. A last little cruelty to carry with her into whatever came next. This was her life now. This was how 40 years of devotion ended. With mockery. With an abandoned cabin in the mountains that nobody wanted. Linda spent her last week in the house packing her belongings. Richard, in his generosity, had given her 7 days to dismantle 4 decades of life. She packed what the old sedan could hold. Clothes, photographs, a handful of furniture, that had been hers before the ring ever touched her finger. Everything else stayed behind. The home she'd spent decades shaping, the life she'd assembled piece by piece, room by room, year by year. All of it left for Richard and Carla to inhabit like they'd earned it. The neighborhood friends were polite, careful. They brought casseroles and spoke in soft voices and kept their distance. Divorce made people uncomfortable. Sam took Richard's side outright, bought the story that Linda had simply stopped trying, that she'd grown dull and let herself fade. Others offered sympathy, the way people offer umbrellas after the storm has passed. Kindly, uselessly. And Linda felt it happening. The thing Richard had accused her of. She was becoming invisible. 62 years old. Discarded. Broke. She was the kind of person people felt sorry for, but couldn't quite figure out how to help. So they didn't. Michael called, Jessica called. Both offered spare bedrooms. Both used the word __quote _18 __. Both mentioned their families, their routines, the disruption. Linda heard what lived beneath their words. She heard the hesitation, the careful logistics of fitting a mother into a life already full. Her children loved her, she never doubted that. But love and room are not the same thing. She would be weight, she would be obligation. She refused to become that. Code 19, quote, she told them. Quote 20, quote. Quote 21, quote, Jessica said. No softening, no cushion. __quote _22 __quote _23 __. Linda answered. The bitterness in her voice slipped through before she could catch it. The cabin sat 3 hours north, deep in the Colorado mountains. Linda had never laid eyes on it. Richard inherited the property from his father 2 decades ago and dismissed it immediately. Too far from anything, too broken down. Not worth the taxes, except as a line item on a return. But it had walls, it had a roof, probably. And after the settlement, it was hers. The one thing they gave her that nobody else wanted. On a cold December morning, Linda wedged the last box into her car and pulled away from the only home she'd known as a grown woman. She did not look in the mirror. She did not glance back. The road carried her farther from everything familiar. Paved highway thinned into county asphalt. County asphalt gave way to gravel. Gravel surrendered to a rutted dirt track, half swallowed by brush. She nearly drove past the turnoff entirely. A bleached sign, letters barely legible. Harrison property, no trespassing. The irony sat in her chest like a stone. She'd been trespassing in her own life for 40 years. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, Linda killed the engine. She sat, hands on the wheel, staring. Richard had called it dilapidated. He'd been generous. The structure was a catastrophe. A small log cabin, 800 square feet at best. One side of the porch had buckled and collapsed. Several windows gaped open, glass long gone. The roof dipped in the center like a spine giving out. Vines crawled over the walls. Moss ate the wood. It looked like something abandoned by people who had already been abandoned themselves. Linda thought about Jessica's spare room. She thought about turning the car around, driving back, admitting that Richard was right, that she couldn't survive on her own, that she was exactly what he said she was. Then she thought about his laugh in the courtroom, Carla's giggle beside him, the way they'd handed her this property like a punchline, like they already knew how the joke would end. He won't see me fall. She said it out loud, to the trees, to the silence, to herself. She opened the door and stepped out. Mountain air hit her lungs, cold, sharp, alive with pine. Silence wrapped around her. No engines, no voices, No neighbors peering through curtains, just wind moving through branches. A bird calling from somewhere she couldn't see. After months of courtrooms and whispers and humiliation, the quiet landed on her like something holy. She crossed the yard slowly, tested each porch step with one foot before trusting it with her weight. The front door was locked, but the wood around the latch had rotted so deeply that one firm push splintered it open. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Mold, decay, animal droppings baked into the floor by seasons of heat and cold. Years of nothing living here except what crawled in through broken windows. The inside was worse than the outside. One large room with a cramped kitchen corner, a stone fireplace blackened by decades, and a loft space that must have served as the bedroom. Dust blanketed everything. Debris covered every surface like a second skin. Rain had poured through holes in the roof for years, warping and staining what it touched. The wood floor had rotted through in patches, soft, dark, dangerous, uninhabitable, and somehow perfect. Linda stood in the center of that ruin and felt something rise through her chest. Something she hadn't felt in months. Not sadness, not numbness. Anger. Clean anger. Pure and bright and powerful. Anger at what had been done to her, at how casually she'd been thrown away, at this final humiliation dressed up as property. 25, she said aloud, to the empty cabin, to Richard, to every person who had pitied her or looked through her. That first night, Linda broke. She sat on the filthy floor with nothing but a sleeping bag she'd carried in. No heat, no electricity, just the thin beam of a flashlight cutting through darkness. And she wept. 40 years of marriage, 40 years of giving everything she had. And this was where it ended. A 62-year-old woman sitting alone on rotting wood in a cabin no one wanted. Discarded, like something used up. But morning came. Linda opened her eyes, dried her face, and stood. She wasn't dead. She wasn't finished. And she would absolutely not, give Richard Harrison the satisfaction of destroying her. That first week was pure survival. She had some money. The alimony wouldn't arrive for another month, but there was a small savings account Richard had never known about. She spent it carefully. A camping stove, jugs of water, cleaning supplies, heavy work gloves, rolls of trash bags. The nearest town sat 40 minutes down the mountain, a tiny community. One general store, one gas station, one diner. The locals watched her with open curiosity. A woman her age, clearly not passing through, loading cleaning supplies and moving boxes into her car. Linda offered no explanations. She didn't need their sympathy. She didn't want their opinions. Back at the cabin, she started with what mattered most. She couldn't survive in the stench. Couldn't think through the filth. Even if every board was cracked and every beam sagged, she could make it clean. That much was in her power. She forced open the windows that still moved. December mountain air flooded through, sharp as a blade. Then she began filling bags. Debris, yellowed newspapers from another decade, nests that animals had abandoned, furniture too broken to name, rot that had no shape left. The work was brutal. Linda hadn't used her body like this in years. Her back screamed after the first hour. Her hands, soft from decades of light housework, blistered on the second day, cracked on the third. She stopped often. Lungs burning, arms shaking, legs unsteady beneath her. She was not 25. She was not even 45. She was 62, and her body announced it with every bend, every lift, every step. But she kept going. Something happened in that labor she hadn't expected. A kind of quiet. Each trash bag she dragged out the door felt like shedding skin. Each surface she scrubbed, raw, felt like a small private victory, hers alone. By the end of that first week, the cabin held nothing but itself. Still ruined, floor still soft with rot, roof still weeping rain, walls still scarred with mold and water damage, but clean ruin. And clean ruin was progress. The second week, Linda went after the mold. She drove to the hardware store in town and bought industrial-strength cleaner and a breathing mask. The clerk, a man in his 50s, name tag reading Tom, paused and actually looked at her. Linda said, the words left her mouth before she could think. Tom studied her face. Surprise first, then something else. Respect, he said. Linda spent days on her knees, scrubbing walls through the mask. Arms burning from the repetition. The mold had eaten deep into the wood in places. Whole sections would have to come out entirely. Linda had no clue how to do that. Not yet. But she could scrub what could be scrubbed. So she scrubbed. It was in the kitchen area, on her knees, rag in hand, attacking a patch of mold that refused to surrender, that something caught her attention. Not what she saw, what she heard. The wall sounded different. She knocked again, harder this time. Hollow. She shifted her knuckles to the adjacent wall. Solid, thud, dense. Back to the first spot. Hollow. She leaned closer. The boards here weren't quite the same as the rest of the wall. Different grain, different spacing, older, maybe, or set by different hands for a different purpose. Curiosity is a strange thing. It doesn't ask permission. Linda grabbed the crowbar she'd been using on the rotted floorboards and wedged it into the seam between the boards. The wood was soft from years of moisture. It surrendered without a fight. Behind it, a space. Not large. Maybe 2 feet deep, 3 feet across, stretching floor to ceiling. A hidden compartment, sealed away and forgotten by everyone who'd walked through that kitchen for decades. Her pulse climbed. Why does someone build a space like this? What goes inside it? She aimed the flashlight into the dark. There, resting on the floor of the compartment, a wooden box. About the size of a large shoebox. Cedar. The preservation was remarkable given the moisture that had destroyed everything around it. Cedar resists decay. Cedar resists insects. That's why this box had outlasted the walls that hid it. Linda pulled it free with both hands, heavier than she expected. She sat on the cold floor, the box in her lap, fingers trembling. This was someone's deliberate secret. Someone had built this compartment, placed this box inside, and sealed the wall shut. Richard's father. Richard's grandfather, or someone who'd owned this land long before the Harrison name was ever attached to it. She opened the lid. Inside, bundles of papers wrapped in oilcloth, and a cloth bag cinched tight. She reached for the papers first. Old deeds. Very old. And as she read through them, line by line, her heartbeat grew louder in her own ears. This cabin. These 20 acres of land that everyone, Richard, the lawyers, the world, had dismissed as worthless. They hadn't always been nothing. In 1875, the property had been registered as a mineral claim, specifically a claim on a natural hot spring. The documents told a story. The spring had been discovered in 1874. Water samples had been analyzed and found rich with minerals believed to carry healing properties. The owner had drawn up plans, engineering sketches for a bathhouse, letters exchanged with potential investors, men eager to fund development. A mineral spa in Colorado, and then a final entry dated 1876. Development postponed indefinitely due to economic panic. Will return to project when circumstances allow. Circumstances never allowed. The owner died. The property drifted from hand to hand. Eventually it landed with Richard's grandfather, a man who almost certainly never knew what lay beneath the ground he walked on. The spring, if it still existed. If water still moved through those underground channels after all these years. A mineral spring with documented healing properties could be the foundation of something real. Spa resorts across the world had been built on less. Linda set the papers down. Her hands still shook. She reached for the cloth bag and loosened the drawstring. Inside, rock samples, presumably collected from the area surrounding the spring. And one small bottle, carefully labeled, sealed with wax. Spring water, preserved like evidence, like a promise someone made to the future and never came back to keep. Linda sat on the floor of that ruined cabin, cold air pressing against her skin, mold on the walls, rotted boards beneath her, and in her lap a cedar box full of history, full of possibility. The property Richard had tossed her way like garbage, his final act of contempt, his parting sneer in legal form, might actually hold something extraordinary. Linda stood there, and laughter broke out of her chest. Then tears. Then laughter again, the kind that shakes your whole body because your mind cannot process what your hands have just uncovered. He had been so certain, so smugly, disgustingly certain that he was handing her nothing. A worthless patch of Colorado dirt, his way of saying, "This is what you're worth." But what he'd actually done, without knowing it, without ever suspecting, was hand her the raw material for an entirely new life. The irony cut so deep it drew blood. That night, Linda drove back to town, not wandering, not drifting. She drove with purpose. A feeling she hadn't tasted in months. She needed the internet. She needed facts. The diner had Wi-Fi, so she ordered coffee, opened her laptop, and started digging. Mineral springs, historical spa resorts, property development across Colorado. What she found made her pulse quicken and her stomach tighten at the same time. Natural mineral springs, properly developed, were genuinely valuable. Spa resorts built around them pulled in millions. But getting there demanded capital, permits, environmental studies, infrastructure. Not exactly the toolkit of a 62-year-old woman with a drained bank account and no allies. Unless she kept looking. And Linda kept looking. She discovered that historical properties could sometimes qualify for grants, preservation funds. If she could document the significance of the mineral spring, prove its history, dig up the original development plans, she might unlock funding to restore the site. A long shot. She knew that. But long shots were the only ammunition she had left. So she loaded one. Over the following weeks, obsession took root. During daylight hours, she poured herself into the cabin, cleaning, repairing, making it livable by force of will. She learned to patch a leaking roof, pry out rotted boards and replace them, install a wood stove so the cold wouldn't eat her alive at night. YouTube became her classroom. Video after video, home repair, basic carpentry, rough plumbing. Her hands changed. Calluses formed across her palms. Her muscles thickened, ached, grew stronger anyway. She was doing work she had never once imagined doing. Physical, grinding, unforgiving labor. It drained her to the bone every single evening. And every single evening, something inside her stood taller than the morning before. But the spring owned her thoughts. She had to find it. Had to confirm it was still there, still flowing, still alive beneath the earth. The old deeds gave approximate locations, but 150 years had rearranged everything. Trees had grown thick, the land itself had shifted. Linda walked her 20 acres over and over, eyes scanning for clues. unusual patches of green, moisture where moisture shouldn't be, any whisper that something was moving underground. January came. 3 months since she'd first stepped into that broken cabin. 3 months of cold mornings, sore joints, silent phone screens. And on one particular day, a day no different from the dozens before it, she walked into a small clearing she had passed 100 times without stopping. But today, there was snow on the ground, and in the middle of that clearing, a circle roughly 10 feet across where the snow had melted. Bare earth, exposed, warm, underground heat. Linda dropped to her knees and started digging. 1 foot down, moisture. 2 feet down, water began seeping into the hole. Warm water, rising through the soil like the land itself was breathing. She had found it. The spring was real, active, flowing in the exact location the old deeds described. After a century and a half, it was still there, still alive, still waiting for someone to come looking. Linda knelt in the snow beside that muddy hole, and she wept. Not the tears she had cried before, not those hollow, exhausted tears of a woman thrown away. These were different. Relief, gratitude, the raw, shaking kind that comes when you realize the ground beneath you is solid after months of feeling like you're falling. Richard had tried to discard her. He'd handed her this property the way you hand someone a bag of trash on your way out the door. But what he'd actually given her, what his arrogance had been too blind to see, was a path forward, her path, built not on his charity, but on his contempt. That evening, Linda picked up her phone and called her children for the first time in weeks. She told them about the spring, the historical documents, the plans forming in her mind. Michael's voice came back flat, careful, the tone adults use when they think someone is losing grip on reality. "Mum, be realistic. A spa resort? That takes millions of dollars." "Just watch me," Linda said. She didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, just those 3 words, quiet and steady as a heartbeat. Jessica was warmer, more willing to listen, but worry threaded through every sentence. "Mum, don't get your hopes up too high. Even if the spring turned out to be real, turning it into something, anything, felt almost impossible." "I know," Linda said. "I know the odds are against me. But for the first time since the divorce, I feel alive. I feel like there's a reason to wake up. I'm not asking for help. I'm just telling you what I'm doing." She hung up the phone, sat alone in her cabin, livable now, barely, but livable, blankets pulled tight around her shoulders, wood stove throwing heat against the dark. And she planned. Environmental testing on the water, historical preservation applications, development permits, a case compelling enough to convince strangers that this forgotten property deserved a second chance, the same way she deserved one. It would take time, expertise, resources she didn't have, not a single one of them. But she had something heavier than all of it. She had determination. She had a direction. And she had nothing left to lose. Richard had taken everything from her, every comfort, every certainty, every illusion that someone else would catch her if she fell. But in stripping it all away, every last shred, he'd done something he never intended. He'd freed her from fear. Because what was the worst that could happen now? She'd fail? She'd already lost everything. The only direction left was up. Linda started making lists, researching contacts, drafting letters to historical societies, preservation organizations, anyone who might listen. She worked late into the night, every night, driven by purpose. And if she was honest with herself, driven by something else too. Not violent revenge, not direct revenge, something quieter, sweeter. The revenge of proving every single person wrong. Of showing Richard that the woman he discarded wasn't broken, wasn't finished, wasn't garbage to be thrown away. Winter passed in a blur of ink and planning and cold mornings and determination that burned hotter than the wood stove. By March, Linda had submitted applications to 3 historical preservation organizations and 1 environmental grant program. By April, responses arrived. 2 rejections, 1 request for more information, 1 acceptance, pending review. By May, the trees around the cabin were pushing out green buds, spring creeping in through the branches. Then the call came. The Colorado Historical Preservation Fund was approving a grant to restore the historical mineral spring property. Funds for environmental testing, historical designation, partial funding for initial development. They'd been moved by her story, charmed by the historical documents she'd gathered with her own hands in that freezing cabin. They wanted this project to succeed. Linda sat on her porch, repaired now, sturdy, rebuilt board by board with her own swollen fingers, and wept. Not from sadness, from disbelief, from something she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten its name. It was happening. She was doing it. She was actually rebuilding her life from the ruins Richard had tried to bury her in. Over the next 6 months, the property transformed. Grant funds allowed her to bring in experts, engineers to study the spring, architects to design a small spa facility, builders to help with construction. But Linda never stepped back. She worked alongside the contractors, learned everything she could, asked questions until her voice was hoarse, lifted what her body allowed, and then lifted more. The cabin itself evolved from disaster into something beautiful. Linda restored it with care, preserving its historical character while making it functional, livable, warm. She installed proper insulation, plumbing, electricity. She refinished the wood floors on her hands and knees, replaced damaged logs, rebuilt the porch a second time when the first repair wasn't good enough. She did much of the work herself, partly to save money, mostly to claim ownership of every nail, every board, every inch of transformation. These were her hands. This was her labor. No one could take that from her. By September, 1 full year after she'd arrived broken and shivering, the cabin was unrecognizable, charming, rustic, beautiful. Linda had converted the main room into a combination office and living space, the nerve center from which she managed the entire spring development project. The spring itself now sat protected beneath a small bathhouse structure, historically designed to match the original 1875 plans. Water testing confirmed exactly what those old documents had claimed. The mineral content was exceptional, proven therapeutic properties. They began pursuing designation as a historical site, along with permits to offer therapeutic bathing services. In October, a regional magazine ran a feature on Linda's project. From divorce to discovery, one woman's mountain miracle, Linda Richard. I read the article. About the spring, about the development. Did you? Linda, I had no idea the property was valuable. When I gave it to you, I genuinely believed it was worthless. And if you'd known, you would have kept it. Linda finished his sentence for him. Yes, of course. The way you kept everything else. That's not fair. I built a career. I earned, quote, 47. Stop. Quote, 48. Just stop. I don't want to hear it again. You told me everything I contributed was worthless. Fine, you won. You got the house, the money, the young girlfriend. I got the worthless cabin. She paused, let the silence do its work. We're both happy with how things turned out. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk about. Carla and I, we're not together anymore. That's unfortunate. It is, he swallowed. And the business has been struggling. The real estate market has been difficult. I made some investments that didn't pan out. I'm facing some financial challenges. There it was, the truth beneath the visit. He hadn't driven up this mountain to apologize. He hadn't come to see what she'd built. He hadn't come to acknowledge what she'd become. He'd come to ask for money. "I see," she said carefully. "And since this property was technically marital property at the time of the divorce, I think there's a case to be made that I'm entitled to a percentage of its current value. My lawyer thinks—" "Stop!" Linda's voice cut through the air like a blade, louder now, harder. "Richard, listen to what's coming out of your mouth. You handed me this property as a punchline, a parting cruelty. You stood in that courthouse and you laughed at me. You gave it to me because you believed it was garbage, because you wanted one final moment of watching me break. And now, quote 58, now that I've built something from it, you want your share. I'm just saying that legally, quote 60, legally the divorce is final. The property was deeded to me. Every dollar of value it holds came from work these hands did. Discoveries I made, grants I fought for and won. You contributed nothing, nothing but contempt. Linda, I'm struggling. I need help." Something cracked open inside her then. Not sympathy, not softness. Something older. Something that had been pressing against her ribs for 4 decades. "After everything," her voice climbed. Anger, real, earned, blazing anger, broke through the surface. "After 40 years of running your household so you could chase your career without a single backward glance. After raising your children, entertaining your clients, standing behind every decision you ever made with a smile on my face and my own dreams shoved into a drawer. After I surrendered my ambitions so yours could breathe, you don't get to stand on my porch and tell me you're owed something." She took a step toward him. "I gave you a comfortable life, Richard. You gave me a cage. And when I got older, when I stopped being decorative enough for you, you threw me out like something broken. You handed me this cabin as one last humiliation." Her chin lifted. "Well, guess what? You set me free by trying to destroy me. You actually saved me. This place, this worthless property, it taught me something I should have learned decades ago." Her eyes held his without flinching. "I was never the worthless one. You were." Richard stood motionless. His face cycled through expressions like weather. Anger, confusion, and underneath it all, something he probably hadn't felt in years. Shame, maybe. Something close to it. "I made a mistake," he said. "Quiet now, almost small. With you, with Carla, with all of it. I see that now. I'm sorry you regret your choices, but your regret isn't my responsibility. I spent 40 years making your comfort my responsibility. I'm done with that. So you won't help me. Help yourself, Richard." "The way I had to." She turned her back on him, walked toward the contractors without looking over her shoulder. Behind her, the sound of an engine turning over, tires on gravel, the car pulling away. She didn't watch him leave. That evening, Linda sat on her porch, a glass of wine in her hand. The sunset poured gold and purple across the mountains like something painted by a hand steadier than any human's. And she felt it, something settling deep in her chest. Not happiness exactly, something quieter. Closure. Peace. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply arrives and stays. Richard had come for one last extraction, one final attempt to take from her, and she'd stood like stone. The woman who would have crumbled 12 months ago, who would have apologized, smoothed things over, made herself smaller so he could feel bigger. That woman was gone. Buried somewhere beneath the foundation stones Linda had laid with her own swollen hands. In her place stood someone who knew what she was worth. Someone who'd rebuilt herself from actual ruins. The spring opened for therapeutic bathing in March. 18 months after Linda had first arrived at the cabin with nothing but a suitcase and a settlement that was meant to mock her. It was small. The restored historical bathhouse with 3 private soaking rooms open by appointment only. But it was a beginning. Linda ran every piece of it herself. 2 part-time employees from town helped. The revenue came in modest but steady, a quiet, reliable stream. More importantly, every cent of it was hers, built by her, earned by her. The property's historical designation drew visitors from places Linda never expected: history enthusiasts, spa aficionados, people who'd read the magazine article about a woman who'd been handed wreckage and turned it into something breathing and alive. Some came for the mineral baths, the warm water that loosened joints and softened the kind of tension that lives in bones. Others came because they'd survived their own divorces, their own discarding. They wanted to meet the woman who turned humiliation into proof that starting over isn't just possible, it's powerful. Linda welcomed them all. She led tours across the grounds, walked visitors through the property's history, shared her own story when people asked. And she listened. That was the part that surprised her most. How many women found their way to her door carrying the same wound. Women past 60 who'd been set aside. Women who moved through the world feeling like ghosts. Women who lay awake at night wondering whether everything worth living had already happened. "Look at me," Linda would say to them. 64 years old. I haul rocks. I run a business. I'm learning things I never dreamed I'd need to know. She'd pause, let them see her rough hands, her sunburned arms. Am I exhausted sometimes? Every single day. Does my body punish me for it? Without fail. Then her voice would shift, soften and sharpen at once. But I am more alive right now than I ever was in my marriage. This isn't the final chapter. This is page 1. The world treats us like we're finished, she said. Like once you pass 60, your only job is to disappear quietly. Linda didn't hesitate. Then don't be quiet. Be loud. Be difficult. Be the most stubborn thing they've ever seen. Refuse to vanish. That exchange, overheard by a visiting blogger, found its way online. It spread the way certain truths do. Shared, reshared, screenshotted, debated across comment sections and kitchen tables. Interview requests started arriving. Speaking invitations. Women driving up the mountain unannounced, standing at her gate, asking one question. How do you start over after everything falls apart? Linda hadn't gone looking for any of it. She'd only wanted to survive, to build something from the wreckage. But if her story could crack open a door for someone else, she would hold it wide. She started writing, a blog she called Rebuilding at 60-some. No polish, no pretense, just raw honesty about what it costs to begin again when the world tells you it's too late. She wrote about joints that screamed after a day of labor, about spreadsheets that made her eyes blur, about nights so quiet in the mountains she could hear her own heartbeat and nothing else. But she also wrote about what lived on the other side of that pain, the freedom, the fierce pride of ownership, the specific, irreplaceable joy of standing inside something your own 2 hands created. People found her words. They held onto them. Within months, thousands of followers, mostly women past 50, gathered around what she'd built. Women considering divorce, women drowning in divorce, women clawing their way back from divorce. They poured their stories into the comments. They held each other up. They became something none of them had expected. A community of women who refused to believe their worth came with an expiration date. By the time Linda turned 65, her life bore no resemblance to anything she'd once imagined for this age. She lived alone in a mountain cabin she'd restored board by board, stone by stone, with her own swollen hands. She ran a business. She wrote words that strangers carried in their pockets like talismans. She was stronger than she'd been at 30, more independent than she'd been at 40, and somehow, impossibly, more connected to other women than she'd ever managed in all those suburban years of dinner parties and carpools. Her children came now, not out of obligation, out of something closer to awe. Michael brought his whole family for spring break. Linda walked her grandchildren through the mineral pools, taught them the names of rocks, showed them how mountain water carves its own path through stone. Jessica came alone sometimes, quieter visits. She'd sit across from her mother in the fading light and ask questions about her own marriage, her own compromises, the shape her own life was taking. "I don't want to end up where you were," quote 83, quote. "Neither do I," quote 84, quote. "So don't." She held her daughter's gaze. Don't spend 40 years swallowing your own voice to keep someone else comfortable. Don't shrink yourself to fit a space that was never built for you. A small smile. And if you do end up divorced, remember it might turn out to be the greatest gift anyone ever gave you. 2 years after the papers were signed, a new envelope arrived in Linda's mailbox. Richard was filing for bankruptcy. His empire had buckled. He was selling the house Linda had kept alive for 4 decades. The house where she'd scrubbed floors and raised children and folded herself into smaller and smaller shapes until she nearly disappeared. Something moved in her chest. Not satisfaction, not gloating. A quiet sadness, but not for Richard. For the years, for the woman who'd poured herself into those walls, believing they were her life's work. For her children's handprints on door frames, long since painted over. But mostly, what she felt was free. That house had been beautiful, comfortable, and it had been a cage with crown molding and a 3-car garage. She didn't want it back. She wanted none of it. Not a single thread from that old existence. That spring, the spa resort company came knocking. They wanted to buy the Harrison property outright. The number they put on the table was staggering, enough to erase every financial worry for the rest of her days. Enough to walk away comfortable and never look back. Linda said no, not because the money didn't matter, not because she was foolish. Because the property wasn't a thing she owned. It was a thing she'd become. Every repaired board, every stone she'd dragged into place, every morning she'd woken with swollen hands and chosen to keep going, that lived in the walls now. Selling it would be selling the proof. The proof that a 65-year-old woman with nothing could build something real. Something that breathed, something that was hers alone. But Linda was no fool. The offer gave her something better than a check. It gave her position. She countered with a partnership. The resort company would invest in expanding her facility. In return, they'd receive a minority stake. Linda kept control. Linda kept ownership. But now she had resources, real resources, to grow what her hands had started. By her 66th birthday, the small bathhouse had stretched into a modest spa retreat. Still rooted in the history of the land, still run by her personally, her voice in every detail, her eye on every guest. But professional now, and profitable. 8 people from the local community drew paychecks because of what she'd built. 8 families fed, in part, by a woman the world had written off. She'd become something no one, least of all Richard, had ever imagined. A significant local business owner. A town success story. A name people spoke with respect. On quiet evenings, Linda still sat on her porch, the porch she'd rebuilt with her own aching hands. And she let herself think. She thought about the courtroom, Richard's laugh, that careless, dismissive sound, like he was flicking away something that had never mattered. She thought about the woman who'd stood in that courtroom, afraid, diminished. A woman who measured her worth by whether her husband still wanted her. Then she thought about the woman sitting here now, hands scarred from work, back that still protested every morning, but strong, independent, valued, not for what she'd sacrificed, but for what she'd created. The greatest treasure had never been the mineral spring. Linda understood that now, in the marrow of her bones. The greatest treasure had been the necessity itself, the stripping away, the forced rebuilding that left her no choice but to discover who she actually was beneath 40 years of compromises, 40 years of shrinking, 40 years of disappearing into someone else's life. Richard had believed he was throwing away garbage. What he'd actually done was cut the rope. Sometimes, Linda thought, the worst things that happen to us arrive wearing the face of disaster. Sometimes, being discarded is the first honest act of liberation you've ever received. Sometimes, the day your life shatters is the day your real life starts breathing. The sun dropped behind the mountains she now called home. The light went amber, then gold, then deep burning orange against the ridgeline. Linda raised a glass of wine. Not to anyone else, to herself, to the cabin, to every bruised morning and frozen night and moment of despair that had brought her to this porch, this view, this life. Thank you, Richard, she whispered into the evening air, for underestimating me, for throwing me away, for giving me the greatest gift you ever gave me, the chance to discover I never needed you at all. And she smiled. Free, happy, more alive at 66 than she had ever been at 26 or 46. The divorce hadn't been her ending, it had been the lock breaking open. And the cabin Richard had tossed at her like trash, that had been the chest holding her real life. It just needed her hands to open it. It just needed her to claim what had always been hers. Herself. If this story touched something in you, leave one word in the comments about what it stirred. And if you've ever had to rebuild after someone tried to break you, share that story. Because we are stronger together. We are never too old to begin again. And no one gets to define our worth but us. What they called our ending, life calls our beginning. Hold that close. 3 years after Linda's divorce became final, her life had found a rhythm she couldn't have imagined in her darkest nights. The spa retreat was thriving, booked months in advance. The cabin and grounds had become a destination, written up in travel magazines, featured on wellness blogs, highlighted in historical tourism guides. But for Linda, the real transformation had nothing to do with the property. It lived inside her. She rose before the sun every morning, made coffee in a kitchen her own hands had torn apart and put back together. Stood on a porch she'd rebuilt board by board and watched light spill across the mountains. Every corner of this place carried a scar that matched one of hers. The floorboard she'd pried up and replaced when her knees screamed at her to stop. The walls she'd scrubbed until her shoulders burned. The garden she'd planted in soil everyone said was too rocky, too thin, too dead to grow anything. This was not a property. This was proof. Her blog had become something she never planned. Rebuilding at 60-some. Over 50,000 followers now. Women of every age, but especially the ones past 50. The ones who'd been patted on the head and told their best years were behind them. Linda posted every week. Practical things, how to fix a leaking pipe, how to sand a floor without destroying your back, but also the harder things. Aging, independence, what it means to discover your own worth after 6 decades of measuring it through someone else's eyes. The comment section had turned into something sacred. a gathering place. Women holding each other up through divorces, career collapses, children who stopped calling, and the slow grinding erosion of being old in a world that only sees the young. One post had hit a nerve deeper than any other. Linda had written about the day Richard appeared at her cabin, about his request for money, about the flatness she felt when she turned him away, not anger, not satisfaction, not grief, just nothing. For 40 years, his opinion of me was my opinion of me, she'd written. His approval was my compass. His disappointment was my failure. The greatest gift of divorce wasn't the cabin or the spring. It was discovering I could survive, could thrive without his validation. I spent 62 years believing my worth came from taking care of others. I'm spending my 60s learning that my worth comes from taking care of myself. That post traveled, tens of thousands of shares. Women wrote to say it gave them the spine to walk away from marriages that had been hollowing them out for decades. Others said it pushed them to open a business, to pick up a paintbrush, to enroll in a class they'd been afraid to try. Linda read every message. She was humbled by all of them. She hadn't set out to become anyone's beacon. She'd just been trying not to drown. But apparently, the act of refusing to drown was its own kind of light. The business grew at a steady pace. Linda brought on a manager for the daily operations, the scheduling, the bookkeeping, the logistics that drained her. She kept the pieces that fed her soul, designing new treatments drawn from the mineral water, leading historical tours through the property's old bones, sitting across from guests who hadn't come for a spa day at all. They'd come because they'd read her story. They wanted to stand where she'd stood, touch the walls she'd rebuilt, see with their own eyes that starting over past 60 was not a fairy tale. Linda gave them her time, every single one. She'd sit with them on her porch, the one she'd nailed together with swollen fingers and a back that wouldn't straighten, and she'd share her story. Then she'd close her mouth and listen to theirs. Some were freshly divorced, shaking with terror at the empty road ahead. Others were still married, but circling the edge, desperate to leave, but paralyzed by the fear of losing security. And some were in fine marriages, but felt like ghosts, invisible, irrelevant, dismissed by a world that looked at an aging woman and saw a problem instead of a person. You're not invisible, __quote _93 __. Society wants you to believe that, because invisible women don't demand their share of resources, of respect, of opportunity. But you're only invisible if you agree to disappear, refuse. I don't know who I am without him, Patricia said. I was his wife for so long. Now I'm just nobody. You're not nobody, she said quietly. You're someone who gave 50 years to a partnership. That's a beautiful thing. But you're also someone separate, someone with her own interests, her own capabilities, her own dreams that got folded up and put in a drawer. It's not too late to open that drawer. She paused, let the silence hold. I started over at 71. At 62, Linda said plainly. You're ahead of the game. __quote _102 __. Thank you for showing us it's possible. That conversation lodged itself somewhere deep. Linda understood, slowly, that she had become a symbol of something far bigger than one woman and one cabin in Colorado. The business, the blog, the bathhouse. None of it mattered on its own. Each was just a vessel carrying a single stubborn truth, that a woman's life does not expire at menopause, does not close at retirement, does not end when a husband walks out the door or a casket goes into the ground. That 60 or 70 or 80 can be a starting line. That reinvention has no deadline. On the 4th anniversary of her arrival at the cabin, Linda opened the doors wide. She invited her blog readers, local neighbors, complete strangers. anyone who wanted to come. Hundreds showed up. The Harrison property filled with women of every age. They toured the bathhouse, walked the grounds, shared stories they'd been carrying alone for years, sometimes decades. Late in the afternoon, Linda stood on her porch and faced the crowd. 4 years ago, I came here with nothing. I'd lost my marriage, my home, my identity. My ex-husband gave me this property as a joke. He expected me to crumble. I nearly did. Those first weeks, I cried every single night. I was terrified. I was alone. I was absolutely convinced I was too old to begin again. I was wrong. And every woman who has ever been told she's too old, too worn out, too far past her prime to build something new, that woman has been lied to. We are not finished at 50, not at 60, not at 70. We are not done contributing, not done creating, not done growing. We are not invisible, unless we decide to be. This cabin was supposed to be my humiliation. It became my liberation. And I want every woman standing here to hear this. Whatever you're facing, whatever you've lost, whatever number is on your birthday cake, it is not too late. It is never too late to rebuild, to reinvent. To refuse anyone else's definition of who you're supposed to be. The applause shook the air. Women wept openly. They grabbed each other's hands, exchanged phone numbers and promises they intended to keep. Linda had not planned a movement, but a movement had found her anyway. A gathering of women who refused to fade away on someone else's schedule. That evening, after the last car pulled down the mountain road, Linda's children came. Michael and Jessica, both in their 40s now, settled into chairs on the porch they'd helped their mother rebuild during a visit 2 summers back. "Mom, you're incredible," quote 105 quote. "How did you do all of this?" quote 106 quote. Honestly, I didn't have a choice. When everything is gone, truly gone, you either lie down or you build. I built. But if I'm being real with you, I think the only reason I found the strength was anger. 40 years of my life, dismissed. Like none of it counted, like I was nothing. That fury carried me through the first year. After that, something else moved in. Pride, maybe. Stubbornness. The slow, shocking realization that I could actually do this. That my hands worked. That my mind worked. That I worked. Do you ever regret it? The divorce, I mean. Do you ever wish Dad had stayed? I regret how it happened. The cruelty of it. The humiliation. I regret every year I spent making myself smaller than I needed to be, just to fit inside his idea of a wife. But the divorce itself? No. It set me free to become who I actually am, not who I thought he needed me to be. If Richard had stayed, I'd have grown old inside a comfortable cage, polished and quiet and shrinking. I never would have discovered I could do any of this. They sat together in the stillness. Stars emerged one by one above the Colorado peaks, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "Dad called me last week." Linda felt something flicker, brief, faint, already passing. Not pain, not even curiosity, just acknowledgement that a name from another life had been spoken aloud. "How is he struggling?" The bankruptcy devastated him. He rents now, works under someone else's name, someone else's vision. He asked about you, wanted to know if what people say is true, if you're really doing that well. And what did you tell him? "I told him you're thriving, that you built something extraordinary, that you're happy." Linda nodded slowly. "Good. Tell him I hope he finds his own way to peace." After Michael and Jessica drove away, Linda sat alone on her porch, the way she did most evenings. The mountain air pressing against her skin like something alive. She thought about Richard, not the man renting an apartment somewhere, working for another man's firm. She thought about the man she married, the man he became, his collapse, her ascent. And she waited for something, Satisfaction, maybe. Vindication. Some flicker of triumph at the symmetry of it all. It didn't come. His pain didn't mend hers. His failure didn't make her success mean more. She'd learned that lesson slowly, the way you learn anything real. Revenge is hollow. It feeds nothing. It builds nothing. It leaves your hands exactly as empty as they were before. The real victory was never his regret. The real victory was her freedom. 4 years of hauling stone and sanding wood and laying pipe and falling asleep with her muscles screaming. 4 years of building something beautiful from what everyone else called wreckage. She'd found strength she never suspected lived inside her body. She'd found community with women she never would have crossed paths with in her old life. She'd learned, not as a phrase, not as a poster on a wall, but deep in her bone marrow, that her value didn't come from anyone else's opinion. That was victory enough. That was more than enough. The mountain air turned cold. Linda rose to go inside. She paused at her front door, the door she'd repaired with her own hands, reinforced, sanded, painted. She remembered the first time she'd pushed it open, how it had cracked under barely any pressure, how rotten everything was. The wood, the hinges, the woman standing in front of it. She thought about that woman, 62 years old, broken, terrified, convinced this was where her story ended. That woman was gone now. In her place stood someone who knew her worth. Someone who had proven to herself, which was the only audience that mattered, that endings could become beginnings. That disasters could arrive disguised as gifts. That a woman the world discarded could become an empire unto herself. Linda smiled, stepped inside, closed the door firmly behind her. Tomorrow she'd rise at dawn. She'd work on her business, write her blog, welcome another woman seeking healing. She'd keep building the life she'd made from what others called ruins. Because that's what she did now. She built. She created. She refused to vanish. And she would never, ever again let another person's voice tell her what she was worth. The cabin Richard handed her like garbage had become a palace. But more importantly, far more importantly, the woman he threw away as worthless had discovered she was priceless. That was the real treasure. That was the real transformation. That was the only victory that mattered. 5 years after the divorce, Linda stood at a podium in front of a room packed with women. A conference for female entrepreneurs over 50. She'd been invited to speak about her journey, building a business from nothing, starting over when the world said it was too late. She looked out at the audience, hundreds of faces, all over 50, all carrying their own stories of collapse and reinvention. Every one of them had been told in one way or another that their chapter was finished. Linda felt gratitude so deep it pressed against her ribs. She began, her voice steady, her hands still. She paused, let the silence hold. She held them up, scarred, strong. Her voice dropped lower, quieter. The room leaned in. 5 minutes the audience stayed on their feet. 5 full minutes of applause that rolled through that room like thunder across a Colorado valley. When it finally faded, women lined up. Not for autographs, not for photographs. They lined up to tell her their stories. To whisper through tears what they'd survived. To ask how she found the strength. Linda listened to every single one. She held their hands. She offered whatever hard-earned wisdom her 60-some years had taught her. And she marveled, quietly, privately, at what had grown here. Not a business, not a brand, a community, a gathering of women the world had tried to throw away. That evening, back in her mountain cabin, Linda sat down and wrote one final blog post. What Richard called the end, life called my beginning. What he designed as my humiliation became my liberation. What he discarded as trash became my treasure. Not because of what I found in these mountains, because of what I became in them. To every woman reading this, you are not done. Your worth does not carry an expiration date. Your value does not shrink with the years. You are powerful, you are capable, you are worthy, with or without a partner, with or without youth, with or without anyone's permission or approval. Rebuild, reinvent, refuse to fade. The best years might still be waiting for you. They were waiting for me. She published the post, closed the laptop, pushed back from the desk. Then she stepped outside. The mountain air bit her cheeks, crisp, clean, alive. Stars scattered across the sky above her cabin, her palace, her empire, her home. Every stone placed by her own aching hands. Every wall a testament to what a discarded woman could build when she stopped waiting for rescue. Linda smiled. Free. Happy. More herself than she had ever been in 40 years of marriage, in decades of shrinking to fit someone else's idea of who she should be. The divorce hadn't destroyed her. It had revealed her. And what it revealed was magnificent. If Linda's story spoke to something inside your heart, leave one word in the comments. Just one word that captures what you feel right now. And remember this, what they called your ending is really your beginning. You are never too old, never too late, never too finished. Start rebuilding.